Ernesto Che Guevara was born on June 14, 1928 in Rosario, Argentina, to Ernesto Guevara Lynch and Celia de la Serna. The Guevara family came from a line of Spanish and Irish descent and occupied a middle-class position in Argentine society. His parents were politically liberal, often sympathetic to leftist causes, and fostered in their children an environment where intellectual debate and curiosity were encouraged. This early exposure to politics and literature shaped Guevara's worldview. As a child, Ernesto suffered from severe asthma, a condition that plagued him throughout his life. Despite frequent attacks, he displayed resilience, refusing to let his illness confine him. This determination would become a defining trait of his character, later evident in the grueling guerrilla campaigns he undertook in Cuba, Congo, and Bolivia. Guevara was also a voracious reader. From an early age, he developed a passion for literature, devouring works of philosophy, poetry, and politics. His family library included books by Marx, Engels, and Lenin, as well as classical writers such as Neruda, Lorca, and Freud. The breadth of his reading allowed him to merge political theory with practical action later in life. In 1947, Guevara enrolled in the University of Buenos Aires, studying medicine. He intended to become a doctor, specializing in leprosy, but his true education came not only from classrooms, but also from the roads of Latin America. In 1952, along with his friend Alberto Granado, he embarked on a motorcycle journey across South America, later immortalized in his memoir, The Motorcycle Diaries. This journey profoundly altered his worldview. Traveling through Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela, Guevara encountered widespread poverty, inequality, and exploitation of indigenous populations. He saw miners laboring under brutal conditions, peasants living in destitution, and leprosy patients treated with indifference. These experiences radicalized him, shifting his ambitions from personal medical success to revolutionary struggle. In Peru, Guevara visited the San Pablo leper colony, where he worked and lived among patients. This time revealed his compassion, but also his growing belief that systemic injustice, not individual ailments, was humanity's true disease. By the time he completed his degree in 1953, his perspective had shifted dramatically. Medicine was no longer his calling, it was revolution. During subsequent travels through Guatemala, Guevara witnessed the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenzi's democratically elected government in 1954, orchestrated by the CIA and the United Fruit Company. This event had a lasting impact on him, solidifying his conviction that U.S. imperialism was the greatest threat to Latin America. It was in Guatemala that Guevara first began to associate with communist groups and adopt a Marxist lens for analyzing world events. After leaving Guatemala in the aftermath of Arbenzi's ousting, Che Guevara traveled to Mexico City, where he encountered a group of Cuban exiles plotting to overthrow the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Among them was Fidel Castro, a young lawyer with radical ambitions. Their meeting in 1955 was pivotal. Guevara quickly impressed Castro with his discipline, medical expertise, and deep ideological commitment to Marxism. Castro invited him to join the 26th of July movement, named after the failed 1953 attack on the Moncada barracks. At first, Guevara envisioned himself as a doctor for the guerrilla cause, but he soon emerged as one of its fiercest fighters and most dedicated revolutionaries. He was given the nickname Che, a common Argentine expression used to draw someone's attention, which stuck as his revolutionary identity. In December 1956, Guevara, Castro, and 80 others set sail from Mexico aboard the Granma, a small yacht bound for Cuba. Their mission was to spark a revolution against Batista's military regime, which was notorious for corruption, violence, and close ties to U.S. economic interests. The expedition was a disaster at first. The Granma was overloaded, and when the rebels landed, they were ambushed by Batista's forces. Of the original group, only a handful survived, including Fidel, Raúl Castro, and Che Guevara. Retreating into the Sierra Maestra mountains, they regrouped and began a guerrilla war. In the Sierra Maestra, Guevara quickly proved his worth not just as a doctor tending to wounded fighters, but as a military strategist and commander. His toughness, discipline, and fearlessness earned him the respect of his comrades. He enforced strict codes of conduct, punishing theft or mistreatment of peasants, and promoted education among the illiterate fighters and local villagers. Guevara's leadership qualities shone in combat. He led small units in ambushes, sabotage missions, and direct assaults on Batista's troops. His writings from this period, later compiled into Guerrilla Warfare 1961, distilled his experiences into a handbook for revolutionaries worldwide. Over the next 2 years, the guerrilla force grew in strength and popular support. Guevara emerged as one of Fidel Castro's most trusted commanders, often tasked with critical operations. His Column 8, a rebel unit under his command, was instrumental in cutting Batista's supply lines and capturing territory. In late 1958, Guevara led the decisive Battle of Santa Clara, a bold maneuver that involved derailing an armored train carrying Batista's soldiers and weapons. This victory shattered the dictator's control, forcing Batista to flee Cuba on January 1, 1959. The Cuban Revolution had succeeded. Fidel Castro took power, and Che Guevara, once a wandering doctor, had become a revolutionary hero. With Batista ousted and Castro's forces victorious, the Cuban Revolution transitioned from guerrilla warfare to governance. Che Guevara, whose reputation for discipline and ideological commitment had soared, was entrusted with significant responsibilities in the new government. Unlike many revolutionaries who preferred to stay in the battlefield, Guevara believed that the real revolution began after the war, in reconstructing society along socialist lines. In 1959, Guevara was appointed to several key posts: head of the Department of Industry of the National Institute of Agrarian Reform, INRE, president of the National Bank of Cuba, and later Minister of Industries. His appointment as head of the National Bank shocked many, as Guevara's background was not in finance but medicine. However, his ideological purity, loyalty to Castro, and commitment to Marxist economics outweighed his lack of technical training. He famously signed the national currency with just the name Che, a gesture symbolic of his disdain for capitalist institutions. As part of his responsibilities in INRE, Guevara pushed for agrarian reform, redistributing land from wealthy landlords and US-owned corporations to peasants. These measures endeared the revolution to the rural poor, but angered the Cuban elite and foreign investors, particularly in the United States. Guevara envisioned Cuba breaking free from dependence on sugar exports and US markets by diversifying production and industrializing rapidly. He stressed moral incentives over material incentives, urging Cubans to work for the revolution's ideals rather than personal profit. This approach contrasted sharply with more pragmatic Marxists who favored gradual economic reforms. Guevara's model emphasized voluntary labor, collective effort, and sacrifice for the greater socialist cause. He himself led by example, working long shifts at factories and participating in manual labor alongside workers. This blend of idealism and asceticism was central to his concept of the new man, a socialist individual motivated not by greed, but by solidarity. Beyond economics, Guevara became Cuba's face abroad. Fluent in Spanish and French and capable in English, he represented Cuba at the United Nations, 1964, and in negotiations with the Soviet Union, China, and other socialist nations. His fiery speeches denounced imperialism and capitalism, championing Cuba as a beacon for revolutionary movements in the global South. He played a central role during the Bay of Pigs invasion, 1961, helping organize Cuba's defense against US-backed exiles. Although Fidel was the public leader, Guevara's logistical and military expertise ensured the revolution's survival. He was also deeply involved during the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, advocating a hardline stance against the US and even criticizing the Soviet Union for its willingness to compromise. Despite his prominence, tensions began to grow between Guevara's vision and the realities of governing Cuba. His insistence on moral incentives often clashed with practical economic needs. Industrialization efforts faltered, agricultural reforms faced setbacks, and Cuba's economy remained heavily reliant on sugar exports. Furthermore, Guevara was increasingly frustrated with Soviet-style socialism, which he viewed as bureaucratic and compromised. He began to turn his gaze outward, believing that the survival of the Cuban Revolution depended on the spread of global revolution, particularly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. By the mid-1960s, Guevara was rarely seen in public life in Cuba. Rumors swirled about his whereabouts, but the truth was that he was preparing to take the revolution beyond Cuban shores. By the mid-1960s, Che Guevara's focus shifted from Cuba's internal development to the global struggle against imperialism. He believed that if revolutions could ignite in multiple parts of the world, especially in the global South, the capitalist system led by the United States could be destabilized and eventually overthrown. His famous phrase, "Create 2, 3, many Vietnams," became a rallying cry for internationalist revolutionaries. Disillusioned with Soviet pragmatism and Cuban economic difficulties, Guevara was convinced that guerrilla warfare and peasant-based revolutions could triumph elsewhere. He voluntarily left his official Cuban posts, disappearing from public view in 1965, to embark on what he saw as the next phase of his revolutionary duty. Che's first major foreign mission was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where he sought to support anti-colonial fighters resisting Western influence following the assassination of independence leader Patrice Lumumba. Guevara arrived with a small group of Cuban guerrillas to assist the Congolese National Liberation Army. However, the mission quickly unraveled. Che encountered severe challenges: lack of discipline among local fighters, many of whom were poorly trained and uncommitted; cultural and linguistic barriers, which made coordination nearly impossible; rivalries between rebel factions undermining unity; logistical and health problems, including Che's chronic asthma and widespread disease in the jungle environment. Despite his determination, Guevara realized the futility of the mission. After 7 months of hardship and near failure, he withdrew his forces. The Congo campaign was a humbling experience, reinforcing that revolutionary zeal alone could not overcome organizational and cultural weaknesses. After the Congo, Guevara spent a brief period in Cuba and clandestinely in other countries. He remained out of the public eye, but within revolutionary circles he still commanded great respect. For his next mission, he chose Bolivia, a landlocked South American country with widespread poverty, a history of labor unrest, and a military regime aligned with the US. Bolivia, Guevara believed, was an ideal staging ground for continental revolution. Situated at the heart of South America, a successful guerrilla movement there could potentially spread across the Andes and ignite uprisings in Argentina, Chile, Peru, and Brazil. In late 1966, Guevara slipped into Bolivia under a false identity. He assembled a guerrilla force of about 50 fighters, including Cubans, Bolivians, and other Latin American volunteers. The group established a base in the remote Nyancahuazu region. From the start, the campaign faced enormous difficulties: lack of local support. Unlike in Cuba, Bolivia's peasants were reluctant to aid the guerrillas, often betraying them to the military out of fear or mistrust. Geographic isolation. The chosen terrain was rugged and offered little connection to urban centers where revolutionary ideas could spread. Internal tensions. Guevara struggled to maintain unity among recruits, and some Bolivians abandoned the effort. Government resistance. The Bolivian military, heavily trained and supported by the US and the CIA, pursued Guevara's forces relentlessly. Guevara's health deteriorated from asthma, hunger, and exhaustion. By October 1967, his small band of guerrillas had been reduced to fewer than 20 men, constantly on the run. Although Guevara is remembered primarily as a guerrilla fighter, he was also a prolific writer and political theorist. His works attempted to synthesize Marxist-Leninist thought with the realities of Latin America. Unlike academic Marxists, Che wrote with the conviction of someone who both theorized and fought, blending philosophy with practice. Some of his most influential writings include Guerrilla Warfare, 1961, a handbook based on his Cuban experience outlining strategies for small revolutionary bands to overthrow oppressive regimes. He stressed mobility, discipline, and winning peasant support. Reminiscences of the Cuban Revolutionary War, 1963, a memoir highlighting the struggles and triumphs of the Sierra Maestra campaign. Socialism and Man in Cuba, 1965. An essay articulating his vision of the new man, an individual motivated by moral duty and solidarity rather than material gain. Guevara believed socialism required a transformation of human values, not just economic structures. Economic writings as Minister of Industries. In speeches and reports, he challenged both capitalist and Soviet economic models, pushing for an ethic of voluntary labor and self-sacrifice. Through these works, Guevara shaped revolutionary thought across the developing world, offering a model that emphasized armed struggle, moral clarity, and internationalism. Central to Guevara's ideology was his concept of the hombre nuevo, new man. He argued that capitalism dehumanized individuals, reducing them to profit-seeking beings. In contrast, socialism had to create a new kind of person who acted out of collective responsibility. This ideal required sacrifice, discipline, and an internal transformation. Guevara himself embodied this ethic, living simply, rejecting luxury, and constantly volunteering for labor and military service. For him, revolution was not just a change of government but a profound remaking of human consciousness. Critics, however, pointed out the utopian and authoritarian undertones of this vision. His disdain for material incentives often ignored basic economic realities, and his insistence on revolutionary purity left little tolerance for dissent. Beyond his writings, Che became an icon of rebellion. His rugged image, beret, scruffy beard, intense gaze, was immortalized by the famous 1960 photograph taken by Alberto Corda, later titled Guerrillero Heroico. This portrait would become one of the most reproduced images in history. Ironically, the man who railed against consumerism became a global pop culture symbol, adorning posters, t-shirts, and murals from Havana to Paris to university dorm rooms worldwide. To admirers, the image symbolized resistance, courage, and the fight against oppression. To critics, it was a hollow commodification of a man who sanctioned violence and executions in the name of revolution. Guevara's writings continue to inspire and divide. For leftist movements in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, his work offered a blueprint for fighting imperialism. His emphasis on guerrilla warfare shaped movements in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Angola, and Vietnam. On the other hand, scholars and critics argue that his strategies often underestimated political complexities, and his economic policies in Cuba produced inefficiencies and shortages. His rejection of Soviet-style pragmatism alienated potential allies, leaving him isolated. Nonetheless, Guevara remains a rare figure who bridged the worlds of action and theory, a man who both wrote revolutionary tracts and lived by them to the point of his own destruction. By early 1967, Che Guevara's guerrilla movement in Bolivia was unraveling. His band of roughly 50 fighters had dwindled after repeated ambushes, desertions, and lack of local support. Unlike in Cuba, where peasants embraced the guerrillas as liberators, Bolivian campesinos often distrusted Guevara's forces, fearing government reprisals or simply not identifying with his revolutionary ideals. The Bolivian Communist Party, which Guevara had hoped would provide recruits and political backing, instead distanced itself from his campaign. Meanwhile, the Bolivian military, bolstered by U.S. intelligence and training, intensified its pursuit. The CIA provided surveillance, advisors, and counterinsurgency expertise, turning the campaign into a lopsided struggle. By the fall of 1967, Guevara's men were starving, exhausted, and cornered. On October 8, 1967, Bolivian army units, guided by CIA operatives and aided by local informants, surrounded Guevara's guerrilla band in the Uro ravine near the village of La Higuera. After a firefight, Che was wounded, captured, and taken prisoner. Reports suggest he surrendered, shouting, "Do not shoot. I am Che Guevara and I am worth more alive than dead." The Bolivians faced a dilemma. Keeping him alive risked turning him into a rallying point, while executing him would eliminate the threat, but potentially create a martyr. Under pressure from the Bolivian High Command, and with tacit U.S. approval, the decision was made to execute him. On the morning of October 9, 1967, in a small schoolhouse in La Higuera, Guevara was shot by Bolivian Sergeant Mario Tyrant, who had been chosen to carry out the act. According to accounts, Guevara's final words were defiant. "Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." His death was staged to look as though he had died in combat, but the truth quickly spread. His body was displayed publicly in Valle Grande, photographed and shown to journalists as proof of his death. In those images, Guevara's serene expression and open eyes reminded many of Christ-like martyrdom, reinforcing his status as a revolutionary saint. Following his execution, Guevara's hands were amputated for identification purposes, and his body was buried in a secret grave. For decades, his remains were missing until 1997, when they were discovered near Valle Grande and repatriated to Cuba, where they were interred with honors in Santa Clara, the site of his decisive victory during the Cuban Revolution. His death shocked the global left. To supporters, he became a martyr whose ideals outlived him. To his enemies, his demise confirmed the futility of exporting revolution through guerrilla warfare. Che Guevara's death in Bolivia transformed him from a revolutionary leader into a global martyr. His final stand, wounded, captured, and executed in a rural schoolhouse, gave his life a tragic, almost mythic quality. The iconic images of his lifeless body, laid out for journalists, evoked religious imagery, with many likening him to a modern-day Christ figure. This powerful symbolism ensured that his ideals continued to resonate, even after his campaigns had failed. In Cuba, Guevara was immortalized as a national hero. His remains were buried in Santa Clara, the city he had helped liberate, and his image was etched into monuments, murals, and the collective memory of the revolution. Fidel Castro eulogized him as the embodiment of the true revolutionary, a man of uncompromising integrity and sacrifice. Che's writings and example influenced liberation struggles across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. His manual on guerrilla warfare and his call to create 2-3 as many Vietnams inspired groups from the Sandinistas in Nicaragua to the FARC in Colombia and even resistance movements in Africa, such as in Angola and Mozambique. In the 1960s and 1970s, Che became a cultural icon of the global left. His face appeared on banners in student uprisings from Paris 1968 to anti-war protests in the United States. For many young radicals, Guevara symbolized uncompromising rebellion against imperialism, inequality, and authoritarianism. While Guevara is celebrated by admirers, he is equally reviled by critics. Detractors argue that authoritarianism in Cuba. As a revolutionary leader, Guevara was directly involved in the establishment of labor camps and the overseeing of executions of Batista's supporters at La Cabaña fortress. While supporters claim these were necessary acts of revolutionary justice, opponents see them as violations of human rights. Economic failures. His economic policies in Cuba, based on moral incentives and rapid industrialization, largely failed, leading to inefficiencies and shortages. Critics argue he underestimated practical economic realities. Romanticized violence. Guevara's glorification of armed struggle has been criticized for encouraging violent uprisings without adequately considering political alternatives or the human cost. For these reasons, Guevara remains one of the most polarizing figures of the 20th century. Hailed as a freedom fighter by some, denounced as a ruthless ideologue by others. Ironically, the man who denounced consumerism became one of the most commodified figures in the world. The famous Alberto Corta photograph of Che, guerrillero heroico, has been reproduced endlessly on T-shirts, posters, and merchandise. For some, this represents a betrayal of Che's ideals. For others, it reflects his transformation into a universal symbol of rebellion beyond politics. Che's image is invoked by disparate groups. For revolutionaries, he represents courage and sacrifice. For young people worldwide, he is often a vague symbol of defiance against authority. For his critics, the image is a troubling reminder of a man responsible for political repression. Che Guevara's legacy is a paradox. He was a doctor who became a guerrilla, a revolutionary who became a statesman, a thinker who became a fighter, and a man who became an icon. His life was marked by passion, sacrifice, and an unyielding belief in the possibility of a more just world. Yet he was also uncompromising to the point of dogmatism, often blind to the complexities of politics and economics. His campaigns outside Cuba largely failed, and his economic experiments faltered. Nevertheless, Guevara's enduring power lies in his symbolism. Whether as a revolutionary martyr, a cautionary tale, or a cultural icon, Che Guevara continues to provoke debate and inspire generations. His life and death embody the eternal struggle between idealism and reality, freedom and control, hope and disillusionment.